Hi everyone, I am Tetsuya, and I am from Japan. I am a Singapore lover and a frequent visitor to Singapore. If you are a Singaporean person, I think maybe you might also like Japan for tourism. So I hope you are also interested in how Japanese think about Singapore. In this channel, I will share a lot of my insights about Singapore from my Japanese perspectives. Sometimes I simply talk about impressive things of Singapore in comparison with Japan by explaining the differences clearly. I will also sometimes involve the comparison of Singapore and a few different countries as well. So today's theme is what I was surprised about when I visited Singapore for the first time. I visited Singapore in January 2007 for the first time, so it's already a long time ago. By the way, this video is part 2 in this theme, so there is part 1 in this theme. So if this video was interesting, don't forget to watch that video if you have not watched it yet. As for today, I am going to share 4 things I was surprised about when I visited Singapore for the first time. Now, let's get started. So the first thing I was surprised about in Singapore was hygiene. This is also what I was surprised about when I visited Singapore for the first time. I saw something I have never seen in any other countries except for Japan in my experience. But I found that thing in Singapore. So I felt the hygiene standard of Singapore was amazing. What do you think it is? It was inside the restroom, and the place of the restroom might have been in Changi Airport, if I am not mistaken. Well, what I found and was surprised about was a sanitizer to wipe toilet seats. Before Singapore, I had been to over 20 countries, including many Western European countries. But as long as I remember, I didn't see a toilet seat sanitizer in any countries. This is a story of 2007, so maybe in more countries, toilet sanitizer are prepared, but around 2007, it was really rare to find it in many countries. So moving on, the second thing I was surprised about in Singapore was the construction sites. I was also surprised at the view at the construction sites in Singapore. This is also the reason of the difference from Japan. What I saw at the construction site in Singapore was always the people who looked foreigners, because most people looked South Asian people. Of course, I went to Little India, and over there, I saw a lot of Indian people. So South Asian looking people are not necessarily foreigners, but when it comes to the ratio of Indian people in Singapore, it is very limited. So I could not think those South Asian looking people are the local Indian people from Singapore. That's why I thought the people who are working at the construction sites were foreigners. Under this condition, based on my guess, a lot of parts of Singapore are constructed by foreigners, which was a surprising fact to me. If you have been to Japan and happen to have seen construction sites, every single worker at the construction sites are Japanese people. So in Japan, the cities and everything is generally constructed by Japanese people. But in case of Singapore, the city is constructed by foreigners and not by the local Singaporean people. This difference between Singapore and Japan made me so surprised when I saw and knew it for the first time. So moving on, the third thing I was surprised about in Singapore was weather. Can you imagine why I was surprised by the weather in Singapore? When I went to Singapore for the first time, it was in January, as I said. January is during rainy season. So it continued to rain, and sometimes rained really hard with thunderstorm. So I came to enjoy time in Singapore because of the continuous bad weather. My trip was largely interrupted, unfortunately. But the reason why I was especially surprised by the rain in Singapore is in Japan, at least until 2007 when I visited Singapore, I had never seen any squall in my life anywhere else in the world. In Japan, it of course rained sometimes hard. And if that happens, we certainly got wet a lot, even with umbrellas. but at least not together with extremely strong blowing wind and thunderstorms like in Singapore normally. The type of rain in Singapore was very different from Japan and the ones I had seen in any other countries. That's why I was pretty surprised by the score in Singapore. Now moving on. So the fourth thing I was surprised about in Singapore was what is very famous about Singapore. What I was surprised was the fact that I was not surprised at something often mentioned about Singapore. That was surprising. Well, if I tell what I am going to say from now, it might sound a bit offensive to Singaporean people, but please listen to what I am going to say patiently until the end. I talk about the point. So what I was surprised about Singapore, I am going to mention this time was Singapore was not that clean. Once again, please don't take my words offensive without listening further. But can you please guess why I didn't feel Singapore was not that clean? The point is not that clean. Well, before telling the point clearly, at least as a part of my little knowledge about Singapore before I went to Singapore for the first time, I had heard from a lot of my friends from all over the world that Singapore was a really, really clean country. That's why I was expecting Singapore to be extremely clean in some way. But to my surprise, I was not specifically surprised when I explored and saw the city in Singapore. Do you know or can you imagine why I was not surprised? Maybe some of you might have already known or guessed, but this is a point I was going to mention. Of course, I do not mean Singapore is dirty. No, definitely not dirty. Not dirty at all. And yes, Singapore is certainly clean. Whoever sees Singapore, Singapore is clean, and it is not possible to say Singapore is not clean because Singapore is clean. So what happened with me then? I actually wondered why I did not feel Singapore was not that clean, and I thought over the reason. Then I reached the potential answer. Oh, because I am from Japan. Yes, the reason is because I am from Japan, and I am already used to the same level of cleanliness as in Singapore in Japan already. If I recall my memory, everyone who told me Singapore was clean was non-Japanese friends. So their comparison is not between Singapore and Japan, but Singapore and their own countries. It is in fact rare to find a country with the same level of cleanliness as Singapore in the world. That's why most of non-Japanese friends told me Singapore was clean in comparison with their own countries. But in case of the comparison between Singapore and Japan, there is certainly not much difference because both countries are generally very clean, and that's why I might have felt Singapore is not that clean, though Singapore is definitely clean in fact. I guess when Singaporean people visit Japan, Singaporean people might not think Japan is specifically clean because Singaporean people are from a clean country and are used to seeing clean city in Singapore already. If you are a Singaporean person and if you have been to Japan, were you surprised at the cleanliness in Japan? I guess you might have not been. And talking about the summary of today's topic, it is as shown in this way. So please comment which point I mentioned among these was interesting to you and why. I will try to reply to your comment and let's begin the discussion. I am going to share a lot more videos about Singapore from now on too. So don't forget to subscribe my channel to watch my future videos. Thank you and see you soon in other videos.